The crackling of dry timber consumed by fire is deafening, drowning out even the screams of the dying. The air is thick with the cloying stench of charred wood and rotting flesh. Through the black smoke rising from the burning ruins of Londinium, a column of Roman soldiers marches, not towards the enemy but away from them, to the terrified civilians left behind. This looks like cowardice, a retreat by the masters of the world before a barbarian tide. But the man leading them, Governor Suetonius Paulinus, is not fleeing. He is calculating. In the dense forests of Germany decades earlier, 3 Roman legions were wiped out by tribal warriors who used the terrain to destroy the empire's finest. Now, on the edge of the known world, history seems poised to repeat itself, but on a far more terrifying scale. Suetonius commands a mere 10,000 men, a dusty, exhausted force standing against an estimated host of 23,000 vengeful Britons. That is a ratio of 23 warriors for every single legionary. By all military logic, this is not a battle. It is a suicide. Yet Suetonius has chosen this ground not to die, but to prove a ruthless truth about Roman warfare, that geography and discipline can defy mathematics.
Welcome back to World Chronicles.
Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today we stand on the precipice of the Battle of Watling Street, the ultimate test of Roman discipline against primal fury. But to understand why a seasoned Roman general would deliberately march his men into the path of such an overwhelming flood, we must first look back at the brutal crime that ignited the island. Violation so heinous it turned a grieving widow into a god of war. The peace that hung over the province of Britannia in 60 CE was a fragile illusion, maintained not by trust, but by the jagged edge of a gladius. For the Iceni tribe, an ally of Rome, this illusion shattered the moment their king Prasutagus died. In a desperate attempt to protect his people from total annexation, the king had written a will leaving half his vast wealth to the Emperor Nero, hoping the gift would buy safety. For the other half, it was a naive hope. To the Roman procurator, Catius Decianus, a man whose greed was rivaled only by his arrogance, the death of a client king was not a tragedy, it was an inventory opportunity. Decianus did not merely reject the will. He treated the entire kingdom as the spoils of war. Roman centurions marched into the Iceni lands, stripping nobles of their ancestral estates and treating the royal household like common slaves. When Queen Boudicca protested this violation of Roman law, the empire's response was a calculated act of public terror. In front of her own people, the queen was stripped and flogged, the crack of the whip echoing as a declaration that no Briton royal or commoner was safe. Yet the true horror was reserved for her. 2 young daughters who were brutally raped by Roman soldiers, a deliberate attempt to destroy the royal bloodline's dignity forever. But cruelty, when applied without limit, ceases to create fear and instead forges something far more dangerous. A singular, unbreakable hatred. The Iceni did not cower, they went quiet. A terrifying silence that spread to their neighbors, the Trinovants, who had their own grievances against the veteran colonists occupying Camulodunum. In the shadows of the sacred groves, old rivalries were buried, and a new alliance was sworn in blood. Rome believed they had simply broken a barbarian widow. In reality, they had awakened a force of nature, and the only man capable of stopping it, Governor Suetonius Paulinus, was fighting a different war on the other side of the island, oblivious to the fact that the ground behind him was already burning. Far away on the island of Mona, Governor Suetonius Paulinus was busy extinguishing the spiritual heart of the Britons, slaughtering the Druids in their sacred groves. But while his legions were burning oak trees, the entire province behind him had caught fire. The first warning came not as a message, but as a disaster. The 9th Legion, commanded by Petilius Carialis, had attempted to intercept the rebel horde and was instantly annihilated. An entire heavy infantry unit, backbone of Roman power, had simply ceased to exist, its soldiers butchered in the open fields. Suetonius realized instantly that he was losing the war. He abandoned the campaign in the west and rode furiously ahead of his main force to reach Londinium, the bustling commercial hub of the province. What he found was a city in panic, its merchants and families looking to him for salvation. But Suetonius was a man of ice-cold military logic. He looked at the sprawling, indefensible city, then at his own exhausted, outnumbered vanguard. He realized that to save the province, he had to amputate the infected limb. He announced his decision. The army would march, and Londinium would be abandoned. The scene that followed was one of the most heart-wrenching in Roman history. As the legions formed up to leave, the citizens wept and clung to the soldiers, knees begging not to be left to the mercy of the tribes. Suetonius remained unmoved. He allowed only those who could keep pace with the army to join the retreat. Everyone else, the old, the sick, the women who refused to leave their homes, was left behind. The result was a massacre of industrial proportions. The rebels descended on the city like wolves, burning, hanging, and crucifying. 70,000 Roman citizens and allies were slaughtered in the ruins of Camulodunum, Verulamium, and Londinium. Suetonius had bought time with the blood of his own people. Now, with his back to the sea and the smoke of burning cities filling the sky, he had to find the one place on this God-forsaken island where he could make them pay for it. On the chosen field, the contrast between the two forces could not have been more stark. Suetonius Paulinus commanded the 14th Legion, the Gemina, reinforced by veterans of the 20th, and a grim assortment of auxiliaries. In total, they numbered barely 10,000 men, a thin line of iron against the horizon. They were dusty, exhausted from the forced march across the breadth of England, and painfully aware that they were the last Romans left alive in the province. Yet, there was no panic in their ranks. These were professional killers, men who had spent 20 years drilling for this exact moment. They stood in absolute silence, their shields locked, waiting for the order to kill or die. Opposite them, the horizon itself seemed to move. The rebel host was estimated by ancient historians at nearly 230,000 souls, AO's migration as much as an army. It was a chaotic, roaring ocean of humanity. Warriors with lime-washed hair and painted bodies screamed insults, blowing the terrifying Carnix war horns that sounded like the braying of dying beasts. Behind the warriors came miles of wagons, carrying their wives and children, brought along to witness the inevitable victory. At the center of this storm rode Boudicca, standing tall in her chariot, her daughters by her side, invoking the goddess Andraste to witness the end of the Roman world. To the Britons, this was a festival of liberation. Their confidence was so absolute that they had brought no supplies for a siege, only wagons to carry the loot. But Suetonius, the first Roman general to have crossed the Atlas mountains, saw something else. He saw a mob armed with long slashing swords that required wide arcs to swing, effectively facing a legion armed with the gladius, a short stabbing blade, designed for the intimate brutality of the press. He knew that in an open field, the sheer weight of the British numbers would flank and crush him. But the Britons believed numbers were their strength. Suetonius knew numbers could be a fatal weakness if the ground was chosen correctly. Suetonius Paulinus did not simply choose a battlefield. He constructed a killing machine out of the earth itself. He backed his small force into a narrow defile, a steep-sided gorge with a thick, impenetrable forest, protecting the rear. This was the Anti-Teutoburg. In the German disaster decades earlier, the forest had been a tomb where enemies struck from every shadow. Here, Suetonius used the dense woods as a shield, ensuring that his vulnerable flanks were untouchable and that the ocean of Britons could only attack him from one direction, the front. The genius of his position lay in its geometry. The gorge opened out onto a wide plain where the rebel host was massed, creating a natural funnel. To reach the Romans, the chaotic, sprawling Briton army would have to squeeze itself into the narrow mouth of the valley. This neutralized their greatest advantage, their overwhelming numbers. In that constricted space, 20 men were no better than 2. The rest would simply be stuck behind, pushing and shoving, unable to bring their long swords to bear. Crucially, the Britons, drunk on arrogance, sealed their own fate before the first weapon was thrown. They parked their miles of wagons, filled with wives, children, and livestock, in a vast crescent behind their battle line. To watch the spectacle, they had inadvertently built a wall that blocked their own retreat. They had turned the open plain into a sealed arena with no exit. The trap was set. The Britons surged forward, their war cry shaking the leaves of the trees. Confident they would wash over the tiny Roman force like a tidal wave. They didn't realize they were charging into a meat grinder until it was too late to stop. The Briton charge was not a maneuver. It was a stampede. Thousands of warriors, fueled by adrenaline and the promise of easy plunder, sprinted across the narrowing plain, their formations dissolving into a chaotic race to be the first to wet their blades. They screamed insults, banged their swords against their shields, and worked themselves into a frenzy. In stark contrast, the Roman line stood as motionless as a statue. There was no shouting, no shifting of feet, only the eerie, unnatural silence of 10,000 men breathing in unison. This silence was a weapon in itself, a display of supreme confidence that unnerved the approaching mob more than any war cry could. When the Britons were a mere 40 yards away, close enough to see the whites of their eyes, Suetonius gave the signal. The silence was shattered not by a roar, but by a singular deafening thrum as the first rank of legionaries unleashed their pila. These were not simple spears, they were heavy javelins with long, soft iron shanks designed to punch through wood and leather. They slammed into the Briton front line with the force of a sledgehammer. The iron shanks pierced the Celtic shields and immediately bent under the weapon's weight, rendering the shields uselessly heavy and impossible to extract. In a heartbeat, the front rank of the rebellion was stripped of its protection, their charge staggering under a rain of bending iron. Chaos rippled through the Briton advance. Warriors stopped to tug at the javelins, stuck in their shields, blocking the men running behind them. The momentum of the charge, the Britons' greatest asset, evaporated in a tangled mess of wood and iron. Before they could recover, the Roman trumpets blared. The legionaries drew their gladi, the short Spanish swords that had carved an empire, and stepped forward. They did not run. They walked, a disciplined machine of death, closing the distance on a confused mob. Shieldless and bewildered, the front line of the Britons halted. Then Suetonius gave the order that would turn the battle into a grinder. With the enemy stunned and stripped of their defenses, Suetonius Paulinus ordered the final transformation of his line. At the sound of the whistles, the Roman infantry did not just march forward, they shifted shape. The solid wall of shields broke into independent units, forming tight, triangular wedges, kunai, that resembled the jagged teeth of a giant saw. Like the prow of a ship cutting through water, these armored wedges drove straight into the chaotic British mass, splitting families and tribes apart with surgical precision. This was the moment the Roman military machine demonstrated its terrifying superiority. The front ranks of the legionaries worked like a piston, shield punch to unbalance the enemy, a short, vicious stab with the gladius into the gut or groin, and then a step forward over the falling body. But the true genius lay in the rotation. Just as a Roman soldier began to tire, a whistle would blow and he would slip through the gaps in the line to the rear, instantly replaced by a fresh, rested comrade. The Britons, exhausted and terrified, found themselves fighting a hydra that never grew weary, a wall of iron that refreshed itself every few minutes while they gasped for breath. The tragedy of the British defeat was ultimately a matter of simple physics. The vast multitude in the rear, desperate to reach the fighting and claim their glory, pushed blindly forward, pressing the front ranks harder against the Roman shields. In this crushing crush, the Britons' greatest weapon, their long slashing swords, became a liability. Pinned arm to arm, chest to back, the warriors could not lift their weapons to swing. They were trapped in a claustrophobic nightmare of sweat and iron, helpless as the Roman short swords did their grim work in the tight spaces. Panic began to ripple backward through the horde. The Britons tried to turn and run, but the wall of wagons they had built to showcase their victory was now their prison wall. The battle ceased to be a contest of arms and transformed into a harvest of death. As the panic fully took hold, the British warriors turned to flee, desperate to escape the relentless Roman wedges. But there was nowhere to go. The vast crescent of wagons, filled with their wives, children, and elderly parents, which had been positioned to witness the Roman defeat, now formed an impenetrable barrier. The fleeing warriors crashed into the carts and the screaming spectators, creating a crushing jam of bodies that trapped the entire rebel host against the Roman shields. Suetonius Paulinus did not order a halt. He did not offer quarter. In the eyes of Rome, these were not soldiers to be paroled. They were traitors and criminals who had burned 3 cities. The legionaries advanced methodically, climbing over the heaps of dead to reach the living. The slaughter was absolute and industrial. Ancient sources record that the Romans spared no one, women, children, and even the baggage animals were cut down until the piles of carcasses stood as high as the wagons themselves. Tacitus, the Roman historian, claims that by sunset, nearly 80,000 Britons lay dead on the field, while the Romans had lost barely 400 men. Even if the numbers are exaggerated, the scale of the massacre effectively wiped the Iceni nation from the map. Boudicca, witnessing the annihilation of her people and the end of her rebellion, reportedly took poison to escape capture, denying Rome the satisfaction of dragging her in chains through the Forum. The rebellion was decapitated, its fire extinguished in a sea of blood. But for the survivors huddled in the forests, the Roman vengeance was just beginning. The silence that descended upon the gorge was heavier than the roar of battle had ever been. The rebellion was not merely defeated, it was obliterated. For the Iceni and the Trinavant, the cost of their defiance was total annihilation. Their lands were seized, their people enslaved, and their identity as independent tribes extinguished forever. Yet, the impact of this slaughter reached far beyond the battlefield. In Rome, Emperor Nero had been on the verge of abandoning the troublesome province entirely, viewing Britain as a drain on resources not worth the blood it cost. Suetonius's impossible victory changed the calculus of empire. It proved that Britain could be held, not by the goodwill of kings, but by the iron of the legions. However, the architect of this victory did not survive to rule the peace. Suetonius Paulinus had saved the province, but his punitive measures against the survivors were so brutal that even the Roman government feared he would incite another revolt. He was quietly recalled and replaced by Petronius Turpilianus, a governor who understood that a province of corpses pays no taxes. This marked the true beginning of Roman Britain. Unlike the Teutoburg Forest, which established a permanent border, the legions would never cross again Watling. Street paved the way for 350 years of occupation, bathhouses and roads. Rome had looked into the abyss of defeat and found its cold, hard resolve. Which Roman victory do you think was more impressive? The tactical encirclement at Cannae, or the discipline against impossible odds at Watling Street? Let us know in the comments below, and subscribe to World Chronicles to relive the most heroic chapters of history with us.